which is we finished Gods of the Upper Air. In the last chapter of Gods of the Upper Air, Franz Boas dies. Although we didn't talk about it in those last class, but he dies in 1943 or so, mid-World War II. And supposedly, as the story was passed on to me, he was sitting at a luncheon at Columbia, and he reached his finger up to say that he had a new theory or an idea about race, and then was hit by an electric shock-like thing and falls back in his chair and dies. Actually, that's kind of the way, if you remember, do you remember that movie, you remember that little documentary that I showed you with the weird music? And this guy, Claude Lévi-Strauss, who's one of the most famous French anthropologists, maybe one of the most famous anthropologists in the world, who lived to be 101, I think, died about a decade ago. But he describes being at this lunch, and the way he describes it, it's like the torch was passed on and Boas fell into his arms, and there it was. And he has a lot of great things to say about Boas in this luncheon. The way Charles King describes it is like, he was just there. They didn't know each other very well, and they marched along. But maybe there's a difference between the anthropological lore, the mythos, and what really happened. But you have this sort of guy transfer guy thing going on. At the same time, though, you have Ruth Benedict, and we talked about her at the end of the last class and how she writes Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which becomes very popular in seller in the United States as well as in Japan. And she becomes super famous. She becomes a full professor at Columbia for the first time. She becomes perhaps the most famous anthropologist for about 2 years, from 1946 to 1948. And then she has a heart attack and dies. So that's sad because she was kind of coming into her biggest powers. Margaret Mead, who was her, lifetime companion, ends up being the sort of next of kin in this, and then trying to contact some of the other people that we've talked about, like Cara Deloria, who is out in South Dakota still collecting anthropology stuff. And so she contacts her, but Deloria is too broke to even get back for the funeral. She can't even get on a train to get back. And she basically, unfortunately, sadly dies pretty much penniless and unknown. And her last mailing address is a motel, which is intense. Oh, there goes Benedict. Mead knew Zora Neale Hurston, but didn't, if she ever tried to contact her, there's no record of it, at least according to Charles King. And Zora Neale Hurston becomes also unknown, kind of moving around, broke. Her novels fall out of publication. She had been prominent, and basically dies and is buried in an unmarked grave. And it isn't till Alice Walker writes an essay in Ms. Magazine that sort of brings her back and recuperates her. And then her novels all get reprinted and start selling. And as we saw, we have an introduction for her autobiography by Maya Angelou. She becomes huge, as King described, she becomes a sort of cult figure in American writing, much better known than now, but she had to sort of die first and then get recuperated. So that's kind of sad too. And so we're kind of left with then Margaret Mead herself as the person carrying on this tradition. And Mead goes everywhere. She becomes super famous, writes things all over the place. As some people put it, would go anywhere they gave her a microphone. Came to Harvard College, I was told, in the 1970s. He came up here and stomped around for a few days. It'd be really cool. That'd be a great final project if we had time to figure out what happened to Margaret Mead at Hartwick College in the 1970s. So she becomes in some ways the guardian of the field, but as King described, she had always been kind of derided in the field or ignored in the field by the big guys, the big theory heads, as being too much of a popularizer. So she doesn't actually become that important within the field of anthropology. She becomes very famous, but then there's also kind of a huge backlash to Margaret Mead that happens a little bit later on. Now, I say this as a kind of way of talking about conclusions. The last thing that you say, or the last thing that you write, or the last thing that you do, especially when you're writing your final paper in the last paragraph. And conclusions are always interesting to read because they're almost impossible to do. I told you a long time ago, we've talked about writing beginnings, which is very hard. We've talked about writing evidence, which may not be as hard once you've got a beginning. But the conclusion, I told you that the thesis writing, the thesis statement, the beginning was the hardest to do, but actually it's the second hardest thing to do. The hardest thing to do is to write a conclusion. And part of the reason that is this old-fashioned expectation in the olden days. You don't have to write this down. In fact, from here on out, you shouldn't write anything down except for little tiny words here and there to just jog your memory. Back in the day, probably in the 1970s, when Margaret Mead came here, the Hartwick College came out with what is called the Hartwick Writing Handbook, which was still in effect for a long time. And it said this about the conclusion: the paper, the essay, should end with a sense of completeness, authority, perhaps even of climax. The conclusion should gather the paper's accomplishments and discoveries into a coherent reformulation of the problem that began the paper. So there you have it: completeness, authority, and climax. Yeah, and you know, this is a model of a world, I should say, that is very difficult to pull off these days. In part because our attention span, we can't even make it to the conclusion of the paper. It reminds me of something that in my next class in J-term, we're going to be reading a book called The 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest by Matthew Restall. And one of the myths he talks about is the myth of completion. The idea that just because you painted the map over with your flag on it, everybody was completely under your control and you had them all under your thumb. And so he calls this the myth that the conquest was actually completed and that the Spaniards had control of everything that was going on. And I think that's kind of what happens in this idea of a conclusion. The idea of completeness, authority, climax. It's kind of this world of you know, the verbs there are very masculinized, and I don't think that's I don't think that's a coincidence that people are talking about these kinds of things at the ends of their papers. And it reminds me of something that gets discussed in King's book, which is Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind. And the subtitle is probably worth reading: How Higher Education Has Failed Democracy and Impoverished the Souls of Today's Students. This was a very strange book. I probably shouldn't criticize it too much because it just seems so odd to me. But it becomes this national bestseller, and it talks about how people like me have poisoned your minds and closed you and made you into cultural relativism and bad, and the universities are bad. And it's odd because it's called The Closing of the American Mind, and he's criticizing cultural relativism, which is supposed to be the opening of the American mind. So I don't know. I don't really know what to make of this. But if you look on page 341, this was back in, what year was this? This is like a long time ago now, but it still gets, I think this is part of a genre that is like the whiny white guy genre, where you're complaining about how everything you've lost, you're losing everything to the new people, even though you still have your power and you still get to be a New York Times bestseller. Where did he go? Page 341, 1987, the philosopher Alan Bloom. Page 342, his book purported to survey the entirety of Western thought, yet Bloom could think of very few women worth mentioning. Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict were among those he did, as were Jane Austen, Hannah Arendt, Yoko Ono. Erica Zhang and Marlene Dietrich, all of them part of the problem, as Bloom saw it. So those people are all part of the problem. And so what he was saying is that these people, such as Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, had closed the American mind, had ruined higher education by making us more open-minded. And that was his attempt, I think, to bring back completeness, authority, and climax, the idea that the conclusions had to be good. These days, I think we know now that if you've been able to write the most awesome climactic conclusion, then you really should probably take that up to the very beginning of your paper, because that's what you're going to need to start with. So that's the issue here, which we've talked about, how when you get to the conclusion, just move it to the beginning and then you'll be happy. So what can you do in the conclusion? I think in a realistic way, a more modest way, a more anticlimactic way, you might say, you say, well, you do want some sort of summary. What I tried to do, here's what I wanted to do. I wanted to talk to 300 people, but my professor only let me talk to 2 of them. And so if you're limited, of course, we're all limited by time and the ability that we have 3 other classes, 4 other classes that we have exams in, so that we don't even know what day our exam is. It might be today, it might be tomorrow, you never know. There's all kinds of things to do. And so what you might do in the conclusion is say, okay, this is what I'm trying to do. And here, if I had more time, is what other people or I might be able to do to build on this. This is what I'd like to do next. I'd like to interview 10 more people to get that random sample and make it into science. And the other thing you might speculate a little bit on is how it matters beyond just what you've been reading and writing, and beyond what we do in the classroom, beyond what we do when we're sitting around. Like what difference does it make if people are religious or not? Or what is the reason that those people are using the angel numbers now? Right, Sarah? And so Sarah is you were searching for the origin of the angel numbers. I don't think you're ever going to find that. You can't find that. But what you can tell us is, why is it happening now? Like, why is it so big a deal now? I told this in my intro class and they were all like, they all nodded their head. Everybody knew what that was. And so that's something that you might sort of speculate on. What are the meanings? Why has this come to the fore in this day and age? You'll never find the source. Or I mean, maybe you will, and then you should tell us what it is, but you'll probably find more out about what it matters. Why does it matter? I think that Charles King does a pretty good job in his conclusion in his last 2 paragraphs. And so he talks about on page 344 that if there is any moral progress at all, which is a modest statement, right? He's not saying that anthropology or his book is going to make you moral. He's saying if there is any moral progress at all, it lies in our ability to develop an ever more capacious view of humanity itself. So to try and widen our view of who fits into humanity itself. A widening web of beings who deserve our ethical conduct, whatever we deem ethical conduct to be. So an ever more capacious view of humanity itself, which is a big deal. I mean, that's huge. That's a huge thing to want, but it's also a kind of perhaps a modest goal. And it reminds me of something that one of my favorite anthropologists wrote. Michel Rolph-Trouillot wrote that anthropology has long claimed that the fate of no human group can be irrelevant to humankind. So that we have to think about how all human groups are relevant to humankind. He's written this in the double negative, though, so I'm going to try rephrasing it in the positive sense, which is that anthropology has long claimed that the fate of all human groups are important to humankind. We can't just ignore people, that we want to extend, be more capacious in our idea of what matters to humanity. The fate of, we can't write people off as irrelevant. I think for me, I hope maybe if there's a good lesson to be learned from this whole coronavirus thing, is that you can't just ignore what's happening thousands of miles away. It's not going to stay there. And if we're not vaccinating or doing all we can for everyone, we're not just going to be able to vaccinate a few people and then seal it off. And, the next thing you know, so the last time I used this quote was just when Omicron was coming out, which was 1 year ago. I don't know if you remember that. All of a sudden we're like, cut those flights off from South Africa. Don't let them in. And next thing you know, we all had it here anyway. So the point is that we can't ignore people. We can't ignore people that are far away, because we're all interlinked together. There's someone else who wrote eloquently about this. I think in the same vein. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Injustice in any part of the world, the fate of any human group, threatens the justice that is here. Going on from there, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Who wrote that? Not an anthropologist. Someone who read Anthropology, actually, quoted from Boas, Mead, Benedict, back in the day. One of our most famous Americans. Huh? Yes. Letter from a Birmingham jail. If you're writing from a Birmingham jail, anybody who's writing from a Birmingham jail, you have to listen to them, because they're probably there for the wrong reasons. But yeah, 1963. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.